Gaius Caligula, Rome's mad emperor. Few rulers in history have left behind a legacy as infamous as Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula. In just 4 short years, AD 37 to 41, he transformed from a beloved young emperor into a man feared for his cruelty, extravagance, and sheer madness. His reign was filled with shocking brutality, public humiliation, and reckless spending that nearly bankrupted Rome. By the end of his rule, his own guards could no longer tolerate him, leading to his violent assassination. But how did it all go so wrong? A promising start. Caligula was born in AD 12, the son of Germanicus, one of Rome's most beloved generals. His father was a war hero, admired by the people, and considered the rightful heir to the empire. As a child, Caligula traveled with his father's army, where soldiers adored him. They nicknamed him Caligula, meaning little boots, because he wore a tiny soldier's uniform, complete with miniature boots. His youth was marked by admiration and innocence. He was seen as a future emperor that the people would support. However, when Caligula was just 7, tragedy struck. His father mysteriously died, likely poisoned, on orders from Emperor Tiberius. After that, his family became targets of political intrigue. His mother and brothers were exiled or executed, leaving young Caligula alone. He was eventually sent to live with Tiberius, a bitter and paranoid ruler who had retreated to the island of Capri. There, Caligula witnessed horrific cruelty, executions at a whim, and endless debauchery. Living in this environment taught him that power meant absolute control over life and death. When Tiberius died in AD 37, Caligula, at just 24 years old, became emperor. The people rejoiced. He was young, charismatic, and the son of a hero. His reign began with great promise. He freed prisoners, ended unfair taxes, and gave generous bonuses to soldiers. But that optimism didn't last long. The sudden shift. Was it illness or insanity? Just a few months into his reign, Caligula fell gravely ill. Some believe he was poisoned, while others think it was an epileptic seizure, a brain fever, or even a mental breakdown. Whatever happened, when he recovered, he was no longer the same man. His physical recovery was marked by a psychological collapse, and many who knew him before and after said there was a profound difference in his behavior. Caligula became unpredictable, paranoid, and increasingly cruel. He executed close allies, including his own cousin, and forced senators to publicly degrade themselves for his amusement. He saw Rome not as a republic, but as his personal playground, where his word was law and no one was safe. A god among men, unlike past emperors who sought respect, Caligula demanded worship. He declared himself a living god, built temples in his honor, and even insisted that statues of himself be placed in sacred temples. His egomania was unmatched, and he made it clear that his subjects were expected to treat him with the utmost reverence or face deadly consequences. One of his most reckless acts was attempting to place his statue inside the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Since the Jewish faith allowed no idols, this was an extreme insult that nearly sparked a massive revolt. It was only his assassination that prevented the uprising from exploding into full-scale war. Caligula even went as far as ordering the construction of a bridge of ships that spanned the Bay of Baia. To the people of Rome, this bridge symbolized his belief in his absolute control over both land and sea. He also mocked the government. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot like slaves, made powerful officials dress in ridiculous costumes, and threatened to make his favorite horse, Incitatus, a consul, one of the highest government positions. He even gave Incitatus a palace, a staff of servants, and gold feed bowls. His obsession with absurdity reached new heights, as he seemed to delight in watching his enemies, and even loyal officials, suffer under his bizarre reign. Unmatched cruelty. Caligula seemed to enjoy watching people suffer. He would invite guests to banquets, only to have them executed mid-meal, then joke about it. One of his favorite pastimes was standing on a balcony, tossing gold coins into crowds below, not out of generosity, but because people would trample each other to death, trying to grab them. At times he would sit in court and sentence entire families to execution on fabricated charges. He reportedly laughed at people being tortured, and when a man begged for mercy, Caligula casually responded, "You will die sooner than you think," before having him killed on the spot. Caligula's cruelty wasn't just physical. He psychologically tormented those around him. Those in his inner circle would constantly live in fear, unsure if they would be spared or become the next victim of his unpredictable temper. Even those closest to him, such as his sisters, were not exempt from his bizarre whim. He was rumored to have had a sexual relationship with his sister Drusilla, whom he later deified. This twisted his family relationships even further and added to the perception of his complete moral decay. Bizarre military campaigns. Caligula's insanity extended to his military decisions. He declared war on the sea, ordering his army to march to the northern coast of France. His generals expected to invade Britain, but instead, he commanded them to collect seashells, claiming they were spoils of war. He then held a grand triumphal parade in Rome to celebrate his victory, a grotesque display of his delusions of grandeur. His lack of real military victories didn't stop him from parading around as a conqueror. Another bizarre stunt was building a floating bridge across the Bay of Baia, stretching over 2 miles. He did this just to prove a prophecy wrong, which had stated he had no more chance of becoming emperor than riding a horse across water. The bridge cost an enormous fortune, but for Caligula, proving a point was worth any cost. His fascination with the absurd was not just limited to his public appearances, but extended to his military conquests as well. He craved the appearance of power and glory, even if it meant mocking the traditions of warfare. The empire falls into financial ruin. Caligula's extravagance nearly bankrupted Rome. He threw lavish parties, spent absurd amounts on unnecessary projects, and emptied the state treasury in just 2 years. To recover funds, he resorted to extreme measures. He seized property from wealthy citizens by accusing them of false crimes. He placed absurd taxes on everything from weddings to lawsuits. He even turned the imperial palace into a brothel, where noble women were forced to work, and all profits went to him. His greed and reckless spending left Rome in economic disaster. Caligula's appetite for luxury and personal enrichment seemed endless. To feed his desires, he didn't hesitate to crush the wealthiest citizens of Rome, exploiting their fears of his wrath to line his pocket. The Roman people began to realize that their emperor's madness wasn't just a public spectacle, it was crippling the empire. The final straw, his assassination. By AD 41, everyone had turned against him. The Senate despised him. The army saw him as an embarrassment, and even his own guards feared his unpredictable rage. The final blow came when Caligula began humiliating the Praetorian Guard, his personal bodyguards. He mocked them, calling them cowards, and even threatened to replace them with foreigners. This was a fatal mistake. His behavior became so erratic that even those closest to him began to fear for their own safety. On January 24, AD 41, a group of officers, led by Cassius Chaara, ambushed Caligula in a palace corridor. They stabbed him over 30 times, killing him instantly. His wife and young daughter were also murdered, ensuring his bloodline was wiped out. Legacy of madness. Caligula's reign lasted just 4 years, but his name became synonymous with insanity and cruelty. Rome was left financially and politically devastated, and it took years for the empire to recover from his rule. Even in ancient times, people told stories about his madness. He became a cautionary tale about what happens when absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so, the rule of Rome's mad emperor ended, as violently as it had begun. King John of England. The infamous Bad King, King John of England, who ruled from 1199 to 1216, has gone down in history as one of the most despised monarchs ever to sit on the throne of England. His reign is filled with betrayal, cruelty, and a disregard for the welfare of his people. His actions and decisions during his time as king not only damaged the monarchy, but set the stage for one of the most significant legal documents in the history of the Western world, the Magna Carta. To truly understand why King John is remembered as one of the worst rulers, we need to look at the early years of his life, the mistakes he made on the throne, and the rebellion that led to his downfall. The early years and the struggle for the throne. John was born in 1166, the youngest son of King Henry II and Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. As the youngest of many siblings, John was not originally expected to inherit the throne. His older brothers were in line before him, and his fate seemed to lie outside the immediate line of succession. However, the sudden deaths of his older brothers, starting with Henry the young king, followed by Geoffrey, and then Richard the Lionheart, meant that John would eventually inherit the throne after the death of his father. And John's accession to the throne, therefore, was marred by tragedy, and his reputation was already tainted by the complex and turbulent family dynamics that accompanied it. John's early years were marked by tension and treachery. His older brother Richard, a popular king, had spent much of his reign fighting wars in France, leaving John to manage the kingdom in his absence. It was during these years that John's behavior began to show signs of what would later become a pattern of betrayal. In the absence of a strong central authority, John made several moves to consolidate power for himself, undermining his brother Richard's loyal supporters and making enemies of some of his closest allies. This early political scheming set the stage for the instability that would follow once he took the throne. A reign of treachery and betrayal. John became king in 1199, following the death of Richard the Lionheart. At first, it appeared that his reign might not be as disastrous as later events would suggest. However, it wasn't long before John's true nature began to emerge. John immediately set about betraying many of those who had supported him, including his own family. His relationship with his nobles quickly soured, and his first major failure as king came when he lost vast territories in France. Much of the English crown's holdings in France had been passed down through his family, including the Duchy of Normandy. However, due to a combination of poor decision-making, failed diplomacy, and a lack of military success, John lost Normandy and other territories to the French king, Philip. This loss was a crushing blow to John's credibility as a ruler, as many of his nobles had expected him to maintain the territories gained by his father and brother. Adding fuel to the fire, John's behavior towards his family and allies worsened. One of his most infamous acts of betrayal was the treatment of his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, who was considered a potential rival for the throne. John imprisoned Arthur and later ordered his death under mysterious circumstances, allegedly to eliminate him as a threat. Though the exact details of Arthur's death are unclear, many at the time believed that John was responsible, and his actions only deepened his reputation as a ruthless and heartless ruler. Cruelty towards the people. While John's betrayal of family and nobles might have sealed his fate in the eyes of the aristocracy, his treatment of the common people also contributed to his legacy as one of the worst kings in history. John's reign was characterized by heavy taxation and financial mismanagement. In order to fund his wars and lavish lifestyle, John imposed taxes on his subjects, sometimes without mercy. The kingdom became increasingly impoverished, and the common people found themselves burdened by his greed. He also levied fines on people for the most trivial reasons, and many citizens found themselves punished for the smallest of offenses. One of the darkest aspects of John's reign was his exploitation of the legal system. He used the courts to exact revenge on those who crossed him, seizing land and property from his enemies. The king's capacity for cruelty knew no bounds. He would often imprison his political foes, torture them for confessions, or have them executed without trial. Even his allies were not safe from his unpredictable temper, and many who had once supported him found themselves suddenly stripped of their titles, lands, and wealth. His lack of compassion for the suffering of his people earned him a reputation as a tyrant who cared little for the welfare of the kingdom. The battle with the church. In addition to his conflicts with the nobility and his subjects, King John also had a contentious relationship with the Church. One of the most significant moments of his reign was his conflict with Pope Innocent III. In 1207, John had a falling out with the Pope over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope had chosen a candidate, but John refused to accept him, and instead appointed his own man. In response, the Pope excommunicated John and placed England under an interdict, which meant that religious ceremonies were suspended across the country. This was a devastating blow to John's authority, as the Church held immense power in medieval Europe. Despite this, John refused to back down, and he responded by seizing church lands and properties. His defiance against the Pope only isolated him further and weakened his standing, both with his people and with other European rulers. The rebellion and the Magna Carta. By 1215, King John's rule had become so unbearable that the barons of England, who had long been dissatisfied with his governance, finally took action. They rebelled against John's tyrannical rule, demanding that he be held accountable for his actions. The barons presented John with a list of demands, and after much negotiation, John reluctantly agreed to sign what would become one of the most significant documents in history, the Magna Carta. This document, signed at Runnymede in 1215, was designed to limit the power of the king and protect the rights of the barons and the common people. It established the principle that the king was not above the law, and that even monarchs had to answer to their subjects. However, despite his agreement, John quickly sought to undermine the Magna Carta. Within weeks, he had backed out of the agreement, and civil war broke out. The rebellion against John continued, and his reign descended further into chaos. His actions had alienated so many of his subjects that by the time of his death in 1216, his kingdom was in disarray. His son Henry III succeeded him, but England was left in a fragile state, having endured years of misrule under a king whose legacy would be defined by cruelty, greed, and dishonesty. A legacy of tyranny. King John's reign, though short, left a lasting impact on England and the world. His cruelty and mismanagement led to the Magna Carta, a document that would serve as the foundation for constitutional law and inspire future movements for democracy and human rights. However, for John, the document's legacy was one of failure. His inability to govern effectively and his relentless pursuit of power at any cost ensured that he would be remembered not as a wise king, but as a tyrant. To this day, the name King John is synonymous with incompetence and cruelty. He may not have been the most outwardly violent or extravagant ruler, but his actions, driven by self-interest and cruelty, caused lasting harm to his kingdom and his people. Ivan the Terrible, Russia's ruthless Tsar. Ivan I, better known as Ivan the Terrible, was the first Tsar of Russia, ruling from 1547 to 1584. His reign is one of the most controversial and terrifying in history, marked by both significant expansion and horrifying cruelty. Though Ivan began his rule with reforms and military success, his reign quickly spiraled into a destructive and paranoid nightmare that would haunt Russia for centuries. Early life and influences. Ivan's early life was full of hardship and trauma, shaping much of his later behavior. Born in 1530 to Grand Prince Vasily III and Elena Glinskaya, Ivan was thrust into a power struggle at a very young age. When Ivan's father suddenly died in 1533, the boyars, or Russian nobles, immediately seized control. At only 3 years old, Ivan was left without a protector, and the boyars fought amongst themselves for power, leaving him vulnerable to neglect and cruelty. By the age of 8, Ivan's mother, Elena, died under mysterious circumstances, possibly poisoned by those seeking to gain power. This left Ivan isolated and alone, often subjected to abuse and mistreatment by the very people who were supposed to guide him. The boyars humiliated Ivan, making him the subject of their political games, and often treated him with disdain. This deep sense of betrayal left a lasting scar on Ivan's psyche, sowing the seeds for the paranoia and violence that would later define his reign. During his childhood, Ivan was regularly exposed to torture and brutality, even witnessing the execution of servants. These experiences hardened him and taught him that violence was the only means of survival. When he finally took power, this early trauma would come to define his rule, and his lack of trust in others would shape his actions for the rest of his life. Seizing power and early reforms. At the age of 16, Ivan seized control of Russia and declared himself the first Tsar of all Russia. His initial years were marked by significant reforms aimed at strengthening Russia's military, legal, and administrative systems. Ivan was determined to modernize Russia, creating a new system of law and introducing changes that consolidated the central power of the Tsar. One of Ivan's early accomplishments was his success in the military. He expanded Russia's borders through campaigns against the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, bringing vast territories under Russian control. These victories were seen as significant achievements, cementing Ivan's reputation as a capable leader. However, while Ivan was a skilled military strategist, it was his increasing paranoia that would soon overshadow these early successes. The rise of the oprichnina. By the 1560s, Ivan's rule took a much darker turn. After the sudden death of his beloved wife, Anastasia Romanovna, Ivan's paranoia became more pronounced. Convinced that the boyars had poisoned her, Ivan's mental state began to deteriorate. He believed that anyone close to him could be a threat, and his growing distrust of the nobility led him to create the infamous oprichnina. The oprichnina was a separate state within Russia with its own police force, military and resources, directly loyal to Ivan. He created the oprichniki, a group of secret police who were given free rein to root out traitors, punish enemies, and eliminate anyone deemed disloyal. The oprichniki were feared across Russia, notorious for their brutality and ruthless tactics. They wore black robes, rode black horses, and carried dog heads as a symbol of their loyalty to Ivan's regime. The oprichniki conducted violent purges across the country. Entire villages were destroyed, and thousands were executed. The methods they employed were horrific. Some victims were boiled alive, others were flayed or tortured before being killed. Even children and innocent citizens were not spared. The oprichniki served as a tool for Ivan to maintain absolute control, striking fear into the hearts of the people. No one was safe from the reach of the oprichniki, and the air of terror that permeated Russia created an environment of constant suspicion. The Massacre of Novgorod. The Massacre of Novgorod in 1570 remains one of the most horrific events of Ivan's reign. Convinced that the city's leaders were plotting to betray him, Ivan ordered a complete purge of Novgorod. Over the course of several weeks, Ivan's oprichniki carried out a systematic extermination of anyone suspected of disloyalty. The oprichniki tortured their victims in cruel and sadistic ways, including drowning people in rivers, burning them alive, and executing entire families. Some were thrown into pits, left to die slowly from starvation and thirst. It is estimated that thousands of people lost their lives in this brutal purge. Ivan watched from a distance, reveling in the destruction of the city, which he believed had turned against him. The city of Novgorod was decimated, and the massacre became a symbol of Ivan's escalating tyranny. This event shattered any hope of reform or recovery for Russia, and showed just how far Ivan was willing to go to maintain his hold on power. Paranoia, violence, and the death of his son. As Ivan grew older, his paranoia and mental instability worsened. In 1581, Ivan's rage and violent temper culminated in a tragic incident. In a fit of anger, he struck his son Ivan Ivanovich, who had confronted him about his treatment of his daughter-in-law. The blow to Ivan Ivanovich's head was fatal, and the death of Ivan's son marked the final act of violence that would define his reign. Ivan's own heir, the person he had hoped would continue his legacy, was dead at his hands. The loss of his son was a crushing blow to Ivan, but it was also the death of his dynasty. Ivan Ivanovich was the last hope for a stable succession, and after his death, Russia was thrown into political chaos. Ivan's reign had destroyed his family, his trust in those around him, and the future of Russia itself. The power vacuum left by Ivan's death would contribute to the time of troubles, a period of civil unrest, famine, and foreign invasion that would follow decline and death. Ivan's final years were marked by physical decline and mental deterioration. He grew increasingly paranoid, surrounding himself with mystics and faith healers, hoping they could help him find a cure for his ailments. Despite his attempts to seek out an elixir of life, Ivan was in poor health and consumed by fear of death. He lived in isolation, becoming more unpredictable and even more distrustful of those closest to him. On March 18, 1584, Ivan the Terrible collapsed and died, leaving Russia in a state of uncertainty. His death marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in Russian history. Ivan's reign had left the country broken, with its people traumatized and its political system in ruins. The Oprichnina had decimated Russia's nobility, and the political chaos that followed Ivan's death would plunge Russia into decades of instability. Legacy of Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible is remembered as one of the most tyrannical and brutal rulers in history. His reign of terror left lasting scars on Russia, and his name is synonymous with madness, violence, and cruelty. He began his rule with promising reforms and military successes, but his growing paranoia and violent tendencies overshadowed any positive contributions he made. Ivan's obsession with power, cruelty, and fear-driven leadership created an environment of distrust, suffering, and instability that lasted far beyond his death. Ivan's legacy is a warning about the dangers of absolute power and the destructive effects of paranoia and tyranny. He destroyed his family, his people, and his country in his relentless quest for control. The time of troubles that followed his death served as a testament to the instability his reign had caused, and his name is still associated with the devastating effects of unchecked cruelty. Ivan the Terrible's rule remains a dark chapter in history, serving as a reminder of the devastating consequences that can arise from a ruler who loses sight of compassion and humanity in the pursuit of power. Nero, the mad emperor of Rome. Nero, born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 AD, would become one of the most infamous figures in Roman history. As the Emperor of Rome from 54 AD to 68 AD, his reign began with great promise, but it ultimately spiraled into one of the most disastrous and tyrannical in Roman history. Nero's rule is often remembered for his cruelty, paranoia, and excessive indulgence, leading many to consider him one of the worst rulers of antiquity. Early life and rise to power. Nero's early years were filled with intrigue and manipulation as he navigated the treacherous politics of the imperial family. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Nero was the great-grandson of Emperor Augustus and the grandson of Emperor Tiberius. However, his path to the throne was anything but straightforward. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was determined to see him become emperor, and she carefully orchestrated events to ensure his rise. Agrippina, who was known for her ruthlessness and ambition, had Nero's predecessor, Emperor Claudius, poisoned in 54 AD, making Nero the emperor at just 16 years old. At first, Nero appeared to be a promising ruler. He was under the influence of wise advisors, including the philosopher Seneca and the prefect Burrus, who initially guided his decisions and helped steer the empire toward a more moderate path. For the first few years of his reign, Nero was seen as a benevolent and effective leader, and the Roman people were hopeful for a prosperous future under his rule. However, as he grew older, Nero began to assert his own authority, and the influence of his mother diminished. Nero's relationship with Agrippina turned sour, with the emperor becoming increasingly resentful of her manipulation. This tension culminated in a shocking event. Nero had his mother murdered in 59 AD, an act that would mark the beginning of a violent and erratic reign. Nero's paranoia and cruelty. As Nero's power consolidated, his rule began to take a darker turn. His initial advisors, Seneca and Burrus, soon resigned or were forced out of his service. And Nero surrounded himself with sycophants, who encouraged his worst tendencies. His increasing paranoia led him to view even his closest allies as potential threats, and he began eliminating them one by one. Among those who fell victim to his suspicion were prominent members of the Senate, and even some of his own family members. Nero's cruelty was evident in the execution of numerous individuals, including his wife Octavia, whom he had divorced and exiled in 62 AD. He later had her executed, likely to marry his mistress, Poppaea Sabina, whom he eventually kicked to death during her pregnancy. The executions did not stop there. Nero also ordered the deaths of his half-brother Britannicus and his tutor Seneca, both of whom were seen as threats to his reign. One of the most notorious aspects of Nero's cruelty was his infamous behavior toward Christians. In 64 AD, a great fire broke out in Rome, destroying much of the city. While the cause of the fire remains debated, many believed Nero himself either started it or at least allowed it to spread in order to clear space for his grand building projects. Nero, however, was quick to shift the blame, and he famously accused the Christians of starting the fire. This led to a brutal persecution of Christians, who were arrested, tortured, and executed in horrific ways, such as being burned alive or used as human torches during public events. Nero's excessive indulgence. Nero's reign was also marked by an unparalleled level of excess and self-indulgence, which alienated him from the Roman people and elites alike. He frequently hosted extravagant banquets and luxurious festivals, spending enormous amounts of money on personal pleasures, while the empire faced economic instability. Nero's passion for the arts became notorious as he delved into singing, acting, and performing on the public stage, activities that were considered scandalous for an emperor. Perhaps one of the most famous stories about Nero's indulgence is the legend that he played the lyre and sang while Rome burned during the Great Fire of St. While this account is likely exaggerated or fictional, it perfectly encapsulates the perception of Nero as an emperor who was more interested in his own personal desires than in the welfare of his people. Nero's building projects, while impressive in scale, further drained the empire's resources. His most famous project was the construction of his extravagant palace complex, known as the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, which was built after the fire of St. The opulence of the palace, with its lavish gardens, grand halls, and golden walls, symbolized Nero's disregard for the Roman people, who were suffering from poverty and hardship. The downfall of Nero. As Nero's reign progressed, his tyrannical actions and reckless spending began to erode his support among the Senate and the military. In 68 AD, facing widespread discontent and rebellions from various parts of the empire, Nero found himself increasingly isolated. The Senate, which had once feared and respected him, turned against him. Rebel armies led by Gaius Julius Vindex and other military leaders began to challenge Nero's authority, and soon the emperor was on the run. When Nero realized that the Senate had declared him a public enemy, he fled Rome. In his final moments, surrounded by his remaining loyal servants, he reportedly cried, "What an artist dies in me," before taking his own life on June 9, 68 AD, at the age of 30. Nero's death plunged Rome into a period of chaos, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, as multiple claimants fought for the imperial throne. His demise marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled Rome for nearly a century. Despite his early promise, Nero's reign ended in infamy, and his legacy was that of a mad tyrant, whose actions led to the collapse of his dynasty and left Rome in turmoil. Legacy of Nero. Nero's legacy is one of cruelty, excess, and disastrous mismanagement. His reign is remembered as a period of murder, paranoia, and self-indulgence, and he remains one of the most reviled emperors in Roman history. While some historians argue that Nero's reign was not entirely disastrous, the overwhelming perception is that he was a ruler who lost control of both his mind and his empire. His indulgent lifestyle, coupled with his tyrannical actions, alienated the people and nobility of Rome, leading to his eventual downfall. Nero's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of leadership grounded in responsibility, and the destructive effects of a ruler's self-centeredness. The brutality of his reign, combined with his obsession with personal indulgence, has ensured that Nero remains synonymous with decadence and destruction in the annals of history. Pope John XII, the scandalous Pope. Pope John XII, born Octavianus in 97 AD, was one of the most controversial and corrupt figures in the history of the papacy. His reign as Pope, from 95 AD to 9064 AD, is often seen as a period of absolute moral decay for the Catholic Church. A young and inexperienced man, placed into an incredibly powerful position, John XII abused his authority in every imaginable way, leading to a papacy marked by sexual promiscuity, drunkenness, political manipulation, and nepotism. His reign became infamous, not only for its moral shortcomings, but also for how it shattered the credibility of the papacy, which would take generations to rebuild. Early life and path to the papacy. John XII's real name was Octavianus, and he was born into the Tusculan family, one of the wealthiest and most politically influential families in Rome. The Tusculans were notorious for their control over the papacy, and Octavianus was effectively groomed from a young age to hold the position. His father, Theophylactus of Tusculum, was an influential nobleman with significant sway in Roman politics, and it was this familial power that paved the way for Octavianus's ascension. When Pope Agapetus II died unexpectedly in 955 AD, the Tusculans maneuvered to install Octavianus as the new pope, despite his lack of religious training or moral foundation. At just 18 years old, Octavianus was made pope and took the name John XII. His election was nothing more than a political move designed to solidify his family's power within the city. The papacy during this time was not purely a religious office. It was deeply entangled with political maneuvering, and many popes were chosen based on their ability to maintain political alliances, rather than their devotion to the church. John XII was no exception. His election was not about spiritual leadership or the welfare of the church. Instead, it was a move to secure his family's dominance in the power structure of Rome, a reign defined by immorality. Once John XII took office, it didn't take long for his scandalous behavior to become widely known. The newly crowned pope did not keep the traditional vows of chastity and celibacy required of the clergy. John XII's personal life quickly became a spectacle of sexual depravity, drunkenness, and moral indifference. He was known to have had several mistresses, some of whom were married women, a gross violation of church doctrine. Contemporary chroniclers, such as Leopold of Cremona, painted an image of a pope who had abandoned any semblance of piety and instead led a life of indulgence and excess. Leopold was particularly harsh in his descriptions, stating that John XII's papacy was a time of moral depravity and complete disregard for religious values. John XII's scandals did not stop at his extramarital affairs. He reportedly engaged in incestuous relationships with his own niece and possibly other female relatives, a shocking betrayal of the church's moral teachings. His sexual promiscuity was legendary, and Rome, once the seat of Christian piety, became a den of vice under his rule. Many priests and bishops who worked under him followed his example, turning the Vatican into a center of indulgence and debauchery, far removed from the holy mission of the Catholic Church. He was also described as having frequent drunken parties and gambling, with his leadership marked by excessive consumption of alcohol. What made John XII's behavior all the more appalling was his utter disregard for the sacred duties of the papacy. He used his position not for spiritual guidance or reform, but to fulfill his personal desire. The church was no longer a place of worship and devotion, but a means for John XII to satisfy his own impulses. His papacy was thus a blow to the integrity of the Catholic Church, one that left a deep scar on its reputation. Political manipulations and failures. In addition to his personal immorality, John XII's political decisions and alliances were deeply flawed, further highlighting his unsuitability for the papacy. Early in his reign, he sought the support of Otto I, the Holy Roman Emperor, a man who was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. At the time, Otto I had come to Rome to be crowned emperor, and John XII, understanding the political advantage this could offer, crowned him emperor. This move was supposed to solidify John XII's political position by aligning himself with one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. However, as the saying goes, power corrupts, and John XII soon became paranoid, fearing that Otto's influence in Rome might overshadow his own. Instead of fostering a cooperative relationship with Otto, John XII turned against him. He accused Otto of overstepping his boundaries and attempting to interfere in papal matters. This decision would prove to be one of his most disastrous. Otto, enraged by John XII's betrayal, marched into Rome in 96–3 AD, with his army, deposed John XII, and replaced him with Pope Leo VIII. The removal of John XII from power was a direct result of his recklessness and his inability to understand the complexities of political alliances. His desire for power and his inability to maintain stable relationships with those around him led to his downfall. Despite being deposed, John XII was not finished yet. He sought to return to Rome and reclaim his throne, but by this time he had few supporters left. His return to power was short-lived. In 96–4 AD, John XII was found dead under mysterious circumstances. Some accounts claim that he suffered a stroke, while others suggest that he was murdered by one of his many enemies. His death ended a papacy marked by corruption, scandal, and betrayal, a legacy of shame. Pope John XII's papacy stands as one of the most infamous and scandalous periods in the history of the Catholic Church. His reign was marked by a shocking combination of personal vice, political intrigue, and negligence. John XII's personal life, filled with extramarital affairs, incest, and reckless indulgence, was a direct contradiction to the vows of chastity and celibacy that were required of the Pope. Under his rule, the Vatican became a place of decadence and moral decay, rather than a center of worship and spiritual guidance. The damage caused by John XII was not just personal. His reign also undermined the power of the papacy. His political decisions were driven by paranoia and selfish ambition, rather than sound judgment. The papacy had been an institution of great spiritual influence, but under John XII, it became a tool for personal gain and a symbol of corruption. John XII's actions led to a serious decline in the credibility of the papacy, and it would take generations for the Church to recover. His papacy serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the potential for moral decay when leaders disregard their responsibilities. Even today, John XII is remembered as one of the worst popes in history, and his reign remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Catholic Church. The legacy of Pope John XII is a reminder of the corrupting influence of power and the devastating impact that moral failures can have on institutions meant to guide people toward righteousness. His story is not just a tale of a corrupt individual, but also a cautionary tale of what happens when positions of authority are filled with those who lack both moral integrity and the sense of duty required to lead effectively. King Richard II, a king lost in time. King Richard II of England, born in 1367, reigned from 1377 to 1399, a period marked by political instability, military failure, and ultimately his own downfall. Richard was the youngest king of England ever to ascend to the throne. Crowned at just 10 years old after the death of his grandfather, Edward III, his reign began under the protection of powerful regents. But as he grew older, Richard's personality and decisions, both weak and tyrannical, would lead to a disastrous reign that contributed to his eventual deposition. A young and vulnerable king, Richard II's ascension to the throne was under chaotic circumstances, with his father, Edward, the Black Prince, dying just a year before his grandfather. The child king was left under the care of regents. For the first decade of his reign, Richard had little control over the kingdom, and England's politics were dominated by powerful nobles, including his uncle, John of Gaunt. However, Richard was not a passive observer. As he grew older, he sought to break free from the control of his advisors, believing that he should be the absolute ruler of England. In doing so, he created numerous enemies among the nobles who had previously supported him. At first, Richard's reign showed some promise. In his early years as king, he showed intelligence, and his subjects believed he could restore the strength of the monarchy. But as he matured, his naivety and eventual arrogance became apparent. Richard II was known for his obsession with power and a tendency to rely on a small group of loyal supporters rather than listening to the wider nobility, a decision that would alienate many of his supporters. Political unrest and tyranny. Richard's desire for absolute control became evident as he took more power from the hands of his nobles. In 1387, he took the fateful step of rejecting the advice of his council, and instead, he aligned himself with a small group of loyalists. This led to a series of confrontations between the king and his nobles, culminating in the War of the Lords Appellant. Richard's failure to address the concerns of the nobility and his unwillingness to compromise caused the country to be torn apart by factional fighting. These internal power struggles would severely weaken the monarchy and the unity of the realm. Richard's tyrannical behavior only worsened as time went on. He increasingly relied on favors, bribery, and patronage to keep his supporters in line. In the process, he showed little regard for the traditional customs and rights of his subjects, enforcing taxes on the people to fund his lavish lifestyle and military campaigns. At the same time, Richard's decision to surround himself with a tight inner circle of advisors left little room for balance and representation within the court, alienating the broader nobility even further. The peasants' revolt and further isolation. One of the most defining moments of Richard II's reign came with the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a mass uprising triggered by heavy taxation and the economic hardships brought on by the ongoing wars with France. Richard, in his youthful arrogance, thought he could easily quell the uprising with his military power, but the revolt exposed the weaknesses in his leadership. Richard was forced to meet with the leaders of the revolt at Smithfield, and though he initially offered concessions to the rebels, his later actions betrayed them. As soon as the threat of revolt faded, Richard went back on his promises, causing further resentment among the common people. Rather than learning from his mistakes, Richard doubled down on his mismanagement of both his people and his nobility. His failure to control the rising tensions between the crown and the commons, along with his inability to foster lasting relationships with his powerful lords, deepened the fractures in his rule. A king overthrown, Richard's reign would ultimately end, not in victory but in defeat. By 1399, his once strong relationship with his nobles had completely deteriorated. The crucial turning point came when Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's cousin and son of John of Gaunt, returned from exile. Bolingbroke had been wrongfully exiled by Richard years earlier, and his return to England was met with widespread support from those who had grown weary of Richard's unpredictable rule. With the support of the disgruntled nobles, Henry Bolingbroke deposed Richard II in a bloodless coup. Richard was imprisoned and later forced to abdicate, marking the end of his reign. In his final years, Richard was exiled to Pontefract Castle, where he would eventually die under mysterious circumstances, likely murdered in 1400. While some believe Richard died of starvation or illness, there are rumors that he was secretly starved to death by his captors. His tragic end marked the final chapter of his reign, a reign defined by missed opportunities, miscalculated decisions, and the consequences of absolute power left unchecked. Legacy of failure. Richard II's reign remains one of the most disastrous in English history. He was a man of great potential, born into a position of immense power, yet his inability to manage the political landscape of England led to his ultimate downfall. His early actions as king, though promising, were quickly overshadowed by his poor judgment and arrogant disregard for the needs of his people and his nobility. His inability to foster good relationships with the nobles and his failure to respond to the pressing needs of the common people contributed to widespread discontent. In addition to his political failure, Richard's legacy is tarnished by his tyrannical behavior and selfish indulgence. His extravagant spending, reliance on a small group of loyalists, and complete disregard for the laws of the land made him a deeply unpopular figure among both the nobility and the commoners. His reign set the stage for further political unrest, leading to the War of the Roses, which would continue to tear the English monarchy apart for decades after his deposition. Richard II's downfall was a direct result of his inability to govern effectively and his obsession with personal power. His story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of ruling with arrogance, isolation, and a refusal to listen to those who hold the true power within a kingdom. His reign, though it began with promise, ended as a tragic chapter in the history of England's monarchy, one that serves as a stark reminder of how quickly a king can fall when he loses touch with his people and the nobility that sustains his rule. Queen Ranavalona I, a reign of brutality and isolation. Queen Ranavalona I, who ruled Madagascar from 1828 to 1861, is one of the most infamous rulers in history, known for her extreme cruelty, harsh policies, and the devastating impact her reign had on her people. Her time on the throne was marked by a complete disregard for the well-being of her subjects and a terrifying level of paranoia and tyranny, known as the Mad Queen for her erratic and brutal rule. Ranavalona II's reign brought death, fear, and suffering to Madagascar. A violent and paranoid ruler, Ranavalona I was born in 1778, in an era where Madagascar was a world unto itself, isolated from the influence of European colonial powers. She became queen in 1828, taking power following the death of her husband, King Radama I. Radama had begun to open Madagascar to foreign trade and had fostered ties with the British. However, Ranavalona's attitude toward foreign influence was drastically different. Suspicious of Westerners and determined to maintain Madagascar's independence, she saw the presence of foreign missionaries and traders as a direct threat to her rule. Her reign began with a violent crackdown on the foreign missionaries, many of whom had been active in spreading Christianity. Christianity, in Ranavalona's eyes, represented a dangerous challenge to the traditional beliefs and customs of her people. She aggressively pursued policies to expel missionaries and destroy churches, viewing their work as a subversive influence that would ultimately weaken her power. The brutality of her regime became immediately clear as she arrested, tortured, and executed many missionaries. Those who survived were often forced to flee the island or lived under constant threat. A ruthless campaign of persecution. Ranavalona's rule quickly became synonymous with oppression and fear. She implemented a series of policies designed to suppress dissent and maintain absolute control. The most horrifying of these policies were the forced labor systems she put in place. Ranavalona needed resources to fund her grand building projects and military campaigns, and she saw the labor of her people as a tool to achieve her goals. The people of Madagascar were forced into grueling labor, working on infrastructure projects that often involved the most dangerous and difficult tasks. Thousands of workers were subjected to inhumane conditions, with little regard for their health or safety. Those who dared to resist were met with punishment, and many died from exhaustion, disease, or outright violence. Perhaps the most notorious aspect of her rule was her Great Purge in 1837. Ranavalona became increasingly paranoid as her reign progressed, fearing that rivals and potential enemies were plotting against her. This led her to implement a brutal and far-reaching campaign to eliminate those she saw as a threat. Thousands of people were executed, often in the most horrific ways imaginable. Some were buried alive, others were thrown from cliffs, and many were simply left to die in prisons under the most appalling conditions. Historians estimate that during her reign, anywhere from 500,000 to 1,000,000 people may have died as a direct result of her policies. These deaths were not the result of warfare alone, but from a combination of forced labor, executions, and the constant atmosphere of fear that Ranavalona created. Cultural isolation and economic decline. Ranavalona's reign was not just marked by violence, but by an aggressive isolationism that crippled the kingdom's economy and prevented Madagascar from benefiting from the advances of the outside world. Unlike her husband, who had sought to open the island to European trade and cultural exchange, Ranavalona turned inward. She banned foreign trade and prohibited foreign ships from docking at Madagascar's ports. While this may have seemed like a way to maintain control over her kingdom, it ultimately led to economic stagnation. The island's people, already suffering under harsh labor conditions, now faced the additional burden of severe economic hardship. By closing Madagascar off from the outside world, Ranavalona made it difficult for her people to thrive. She implemented policies that restricted the flow of goods, including food, medicine, and technology, into the country. This lack of trade and technological advancement contributed to the economic decline of Madagascar during her reign. Instead of cultivating relations with neighboring countries or fostering international partnerships that could have helped Madagascar thrive, Ranavalona's paranoia and desire for total control left the country in a state of isolation and decay. The destruction of Madagascar society. The policies that Ranavalona put into place did not just affect the political structure of Madagascar, they had a devastating impact on the culture and society as a whole. The forced labor and widespread executions led to a sharp decline in the population, both from direct violence and the starvation that resulted from poor agricultural policies. The people of Madagascar lived in constant fear, knowing that speaking out or resisting the Queen could lead to torture or death. It wasn't just the elite class that suffered under her rule, but the common people as well, whose daily lives were filled with hardship and uncertainty. Her regime also led to the near destruction of Madagascar's cultural heritage. The Queen's policies of isolation and repression meant that many cultural practices were either stifled or lost. The Queen's purge of missionaries destroyed many of the island's churches, and her crackdown on Christianity prevented the spread of new ideas that could have shaped Madagascar into a more progressive, open society. The religious persecution not only hurt the Malagasy people, but also set the country back socially and culturally. The end of an era. When Ranavalona I died in 1861, she left behind a kingdom that was economically crippled and socially fractured. Her reign was a tragic and violent chapter in Madagascar's history. Though she may have kept the kingdom independent from foreign rule, the human cost of her isolationism, cruelty, and persecution was staggering. The impact of her reign left scars that lasted long after her death. Madagascar's society had been forever altered by the brutality and paranoia that defined her rule. In many ways, Ranavalona represents a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the lengths to which a ruler will go to maintain control. Her policies were not just cruel, they were ultimately self-destructive. Her obsession with power and her willingness to use fear and violence to maintain control contributed directly to the collapse of her kingdom's infrastructure and the decimation of its people. Though history has largely forgotten the Queen's role in shaping Madagascar, those who study her reign understand that she was not merely a product of her time, but rather a monarch whose obsession with control and disregard for human life pushed her to become one of the worst rulers ever to have lived. Henry VIII of England, a king of tyranny and turmoil. Henry VIII, who ruled England from 1509 to 1527, is one of the most infamous monarchs in history, known for his violent temper, ruthless decisions, and unpredictable nature. Henry's reign left a permanent scar on English history. His personal whims reshaped English society in ways that were both drastic and disastrous. From his 6 marriages to his severe religious reforms, Henry VIII's reign was marked by cruelty, bloodshed, and a profound disregard for human life. The Tyrant King. Henry's reign began with great promise. When he ascended to the throne at just 17 years old, England was in a relatively stable position. Henry was young, energetic, and well-liked, at least at first. However, over time, his behavior became increasingly erratic. A king who once sought to be seen as a great warrior and intellectual was slowly overshadowed by an ever-growing ego and desire for personal control. One of the most defining aspects of Henry's reign was his absolute power and his willingness to use violence to maintain it. He surrounded himself with advisors who were loyal to him, but anyone who challenged his authority or refused to obey his wishes would soon find themselves imprisoned or executed. His reign became synonymous with fear and intimidation. His subjects knew that defying Henry could result in a quick and brutal death. The Six Wives, a legacy of murder and deception. Perhaps one of the most notorious aspects of Henry's rule was his obsession with marriage. His 6 marriages are a testament to his ruthless pursuit of power and his desperate need for a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. Henry's desire to marry and remarry was not merely driven by love, but by a need to maintain his control and manipulate the political alliances of the time. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was the daughter of the King of Spain. She had been married to Henry's older brother, but after his death, she married Henry. The marriage seemed promising at first, but after more than 2 decades, Henry became increasingly frustrated by her inability to produce a male heir. This frustration led to Henry's decision to divorce her, a decision that caused a major religious and political rift. The Pope refused to annul the marriage, leading Henry to break away from the Roman Catholic Church and establish the Church of England. This religious schism would change the course of English history forever and set the stage for Henry's later marriages. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, whom he married in 1533, was executed just 3 years later on charges of adultery and treason. Many historians believe, falsely, Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, gave birth to a male heir, Edward VI, but tragically died shortly after childbirth. Henry then went on to marry Anne of Cleves, only to have the marriage annulled shortly after, due to his disgust with her appearance. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was executed for committing adultery, and his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, outlived him. The lives of his wives were marked by violence, betrayal, and suffering. Henry's disregard for human life is starkly illustrated in the way he treated his wives. Those who failed to provide him with a male heir were often executed or cast aside in disgrace, while others were simply pawns in his political games. The dissolution of the monasteries, destruction for power. One of Henry VIII's most devastating actions was the dissolution of the monasteries, which began in 1536. In an effort to seize wealth and land, Henry ordered the systematic closure and destruction of monasteries across England. The church had long held significant land and wealth, and Henry's greed led him to confiscate much of it for himself. Thousands of monks, nuns, and religious officials were displaced, their homes and livelihoods destroyed. Many monasteries, which had provided vital services to the poor, such as care for the sick and education, were closed down, leaving communities in poverty and squalor. Henry's pursuit of power led him to prioritize his own financial gain over the welfare of the English people, and the social and cultural damage was immense. Terror in the court, the executions of political rivals. Alongside his brutal treatment of wives, Henry VIII's political purges are a central part of his legacy. At various points throughout his reign, he became increasingly paranoid about the loyalty of his closest advisors and courtiers. Thomas More, one of Henry's former friends and an important political figure, was executed after refusing to accept Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England. The executions of Thomas Cromwell, once Henry's right-hand man, and many others were motivated by Henry's desire to eliminate anyone who posed a potential threat to his authority. This reign of terror extended to the aristocracy, with several noblemen being accused of treason, often without sufficient evidence. Henry's obsession with absolute power led to widespread executions, not only of those who opposed him, but also of anyone who might have been perceived as a rival. Henry's court was filled with fear and uncertainty, as anyone could fall out of favor at any moment and face execution. Legacy of fear and destruction. By the time of his death in 1547, Henry VIII left behind a deeply fractured England. His reign had significantly weakened the nation's economy, destroyed the social fabric, and left a trail of human suffering. While his son, Edward VI, succeeded him, England would be forced to contend with the religious turmoil Henry had set in motion for many years to come. Henry's legacy is one of violence, paranoia, and unchecked power. His tyrannical rule left an indelible mark on the English people, and his reign is often considered one of the most destructive in British history. His actions directly led to the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent people. His obsession with producing a male heir, his brutal treatment of his wives, and his relentless pursuit of personal gain at the expense of his kingdom's welfare are what ultimately define his rule. Henry VIII's reign was a reminder of the dangers of absolute power and the destructiveness of a ruler who prioritizes personal desires over the well-being of their people. His reign is not just a chapter of bloodshed and oppression, but a cautionary tale of the consequences of tyranny and the unchecked use of power. King Leopold II of Belgium, a legacy of exploitation and death. King Leopold II of Belgium, who ruled from 1865 to 1909, is a name that is forever associated with one of the darkest chapters of colonial history. Unlike many of the other rulers on this list, Leopold's cruelty was not just limited to his own people, but extended to millions of innocent lives in Central Africa, where his personal ownership of the Congo Free State led to the deaths of an estimated 10 million people. Leopold's reign over the Congo was built on a foundation of deception, greed, and brutality. Initially presented as a humanitarian mission to bring civilization and Christianity to the people of Africa, Leopold's rule was, in reality, a grotesque exploitation of the land and its people for personal profit. Through a combination of force, torture, and murder, Leopold established one of the most abhorrent colonial regimes the world has ever seen: the creation of the Congo Free State. Leopold was not a monarch who simply inherited colonies through diplomacy or conquest. Instead, he personally carved out control over a vast territory in Central Africa. In the late 19th century, European powers were scrambling to divide Africa among themselves, a period known as the Scramble for Africa. Leopold, unlike other European kings, sought to control an entire region for himself, and in 1885 he succeeded in gaining control over the Congo, which he named the Congo Free State. But this was not a typical colony. It was a personal possession of King Leopold, meaning that he had absolute authority over the land and its people. The Congo Free State was his private property, and he sought to extract as much wealth from it as possible, primarily through the collection of ivory and rubber, two highly profitable commodities during that time. To do so, Leopold enforced a system of forced labor, where entire communities were forced to work for him under the threat of death. The brutal exploitation of the Congo people. The system that Leopold established in the Congo was one of extreme violence and oppression. Villagers were forced to harvest rubber at a terrifyingly rapid pace, often in conditions that were not just brutal but inhumane. Those who failed to meet quotas were subjected to horrific punishments. Mutilation was common. Men would have their hands or feet severed, or their wives and children would be taken hostage to force compliance. Entire villages were burned to the ground as punishment for failure to produce enough rubber or ivory. Leopold's agents, who were given free rein to carry out his orders, were equally merciless. The Congo became a land of terror, where beatings, rape, and murder were commonplace. The most horrific part of the exploitation was the sheer scale of the suffering. It's estimated that around half of the population of the Congo was wiped out during Leopold's reign. The total number of deaths is still debated, but estimates suggest that up to 10 million people perished due to starvation, disease, and violence during this period. Leopold's deceptive image, despite the horrific nature of his rule in the Congo, Leopold was able to maintain an image of himself as a philanthropist and humanitarian in the eyes of the world. His actions were hidden under a veil of propaganda, and many European leaders and intellectuals were deceived by his claims that he was bringing civilization and Christianity to Africa. To the outside world, he painted a picture of himself as a benevolent monarch overseeing a mission to educate and uplift the people of the Congo. In reality, Leopold's efforts to promote his image as a benevolent ruler were nothing more than public relations tactics. He used money earned from the Congo's exploitation to fund lavish projects in Belgium, including grand buildings and monuments. He even went so far as to bribe journalists, missionaries, and other figures to cover up the atrocities taking place under his rule. Leopold also created what he called the Congo Reform Association, which purportedly sought to improve conditions in the Congo. In truth, this was simply another ploy to manage the growing international outcry against his rule. He would personally fund reports and accounts that praised his actions and deflected any blame for the atrocities taking place. It wasn't until 1904 when a man named Morel, a shipping clerk, exposed the truth of what was happening in the Congo that the international community began to take notice. Morel's investigations revealed that Leopold's regime was built on a foundation of violence and human suffering, and he began a campaign to expose the horrors of the Congo to the world. The aftermath of Leopold's rule. After international outcry, Leopold was forced to cede control of the Congo to the Belgian government in 1908, 3 years before his death. The country was officially made a colony of Belgium, but the damage was already done. The people of the Congo had suffered immensely, and their land had been stripped of its resources, leaving the country deeply scarred for generations to come. Even after Leopold's departure from the Congo, the country continued to suffer under colonial rule. While conditions improved in some areas after the Belgian government took control, the legacy of Leopold's reign continued to cast a long shadow over the region. The economic exploitation and human rights abuses that took place under his personal rule had lasting effects, and the Congo did not truly gain its independence until. It's important to recognize that the Congo Free State, under Leopold, was not just a standard colonial exploitation. It was a personal empire in which Leopold's sole aim was to amass personal wealth through the suffering of millions. His reign was not about economic growth or the development of the country. It was about power and profit, with no regard for the lives of the people. Legacy of Leopold II. King Leopold II's reign is remembered as one of the most brutal and exploitative in history. His personal control of the Congo Free State left millions dead and devastated an entire region of Africa. He exploited the land and its people for personal profit, with little regard for the human cost. His reign is a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and greed, and the horrific impact that one man's desires can have on an entire people. While Leopold's name was once associated with the Belgian Empire, today it is tied to one of the worst instances of colonial exploitation the world has ever known. His legacy is one of violence, suffering, and death. King Leopold II may have been a ruler in name, but his actions show the extent to which his thirst for personal gain led him to commit atrocities on an unimaginable scale. The history of the Congo Free State remains a painful reminder of the power a ruler can have when they prioritize their own wealth and power over the well-being of their subjects. Emperor Commodus, 77-192 AD, the Mad Emperor of Rome. Commodus, who ruled as Roman Emperor from 177 to 192 AD, is often regarded as one of the most infamous and irrational emperors in the history of Rome. His reign, which began as a joint rule with his father Marcus Aurelius, marked the beginning of a slow decline for the Roman Empire. While Marcus Aurelius was a philosopher king, highly respected for his wisdom and Stoic philosophy, his son Commodus would be remembered for his self-indulgence, erratic behavior, and disregard for the very principles that had once made Rome great. Commodus's rule would be characterized by personal excess, tyranny, and a disturbing obsession with his own image, ultimately destabilizing the empire and setting the stage for its future troubles. The early days of Commodus's reign, when Commodus became emperor, he was just 19 years old. While his father, Marcus Aurelius, had served Rome with dignity and skill, Commodus was vastly different. Upon Marcus's death in 80 AD, Commodus was proclaimed emperor, marking the end of the Antonine dynasty. In the early stages of his reign, Commodus initially shared power with his father's co-emperor, Lucius Verus. However, after Verus's death, Commodus became the sole ruler, and his early reign, unfortunately, foreshadowed the chaos and decadence that would follow. Instead of focusing on matters of state or military strategy, Commodus found himself captivated by gladiatorial combat, which was highly popular in Rome. Unlike previous emperors who sought to defend the empire and uphold its traditions, Commodus became obsessed with personal glory and fame. He saw himself as a living god, and his obsession with his own greatness led him to believe that he was the reincarnation of Hercules, the Greek mythological hero. This self-aggrandizing belief would shape much of his rule, and it would lead to some of the most absurd and damaging decisions in Roman history. Commodus's self-glorification in the arena. One of the most bizarre and disturbing aspects of Commodus's reign was his obsession with the gladiatorial games. Gladiatorial combat was a spectacle enjoyed by the Roman public, but for Commodus, it became a personal stage to showcase his power and heroism. He did not just watch from the sidelines like other emperors. Instead, he participated in the games himself, which was scandalous for a ruler. He would appear in the Colosseum, dressed as Hercules, wielding a club and wearing a lion's skin. The emperor would participate in fights against gladiators, but in a deeply unfair way. He insisted on facing weakened opponents or even dismembered men to ensure that he would always be victorious. His participation in the games was not an expression of strength or valor, but rather a grotesque display of vanity. While many emperors had used the games to show their might and influence, Commodus took it to a whole new level. By fighting in over 700 bouts against opponents who had little chance of defeating him, his gladiatorial obsession became an integral part of his self-image. His victories in the arena were grandiose, but they were staged and hollow, offering no true demonstration of skill or bravery. Commodus's reign, therefore, became about personal exhibitionism, not governance or the welfare of the empire. His people, once accustomed to wise emperors who served them, were now subjected to the whims of a ruler who was obsessed with being adored and worshipped. Commodus's paranoia and tyranny, Commodus's self-centeredness and obsession with fame led him to become increasingly paranoid. He surrounded himself with yes-men and sycophants, unable to trust anyone who did not constantly praise him. This paranoia led to repeated purges of officials, including high-ranking senators, military leaders, and advisors, many of whom were executed or exiled for the slightest perceived insult or threat. His mistrust of those closest to him undermined the very stability of his government. Instead of listening to competent military generals or respected advisors, Commodus preferred to rule through fear. The once proud Roman Senate became a shell of its former self, as Commodus disregarded its counsel. His rule also saw an uptick in brutal executions of both political rivals and individuals. It destabilized him in any way. The emperor's delusions of grandeur turned deadly, as he sought to eliminate anyone who did not support his vision of himself as a god. With such widespread paranoia, the empire's administration became increasingly inefficient and corrupt. The emperor's excessive demands drained the empire's resources, and his growing cruelty alienated even his closest ally. Economic ruin and the empire's decline. One of the lesser-known, but incredibly damaging aspects of Commodus's rule was his mismanagement of the economy. Despite being the emperor of a vast empire, Commodus seemed oblivious to the suffering of the Roman people. His lavish lifestyle complete with extravagant spending on public games, massive construction projects, and personal luxuries, drained the imperial treasury. Rome's economy, which had once been robust and thriving, began to show signs of decline during Commodus's reign. The emperor's selfishness meant that soldiers, who were crucial to the empire's defense, were underpaid and neglected. This created discontent within the military ranks, as well as among the people who were increasingly burdened by higher taxes and economic instability. Commodus's indulgence in luxury and disregard for the empire's well-being only hastened its decline. Rome's borders, once secure under his father, were left vulnerable, while Commodus spent his days parading through Rome in false triumphs. Enemies of the empire, both within and beyond its borders, took advantage of its weakening state. As military and economic troubles mounted, Commodus failed to act decisively, and the empire suffered from a lack of leadership during critical times. Commodus's death and the aftermath. Commodus's erratic rule finally came to a dramatic end in 1920 AD, when a conspiracy involving members of his inner circle led to his assassination. The plot was carried out by his closest advisors, including his own sister, Lucilla, and his chamberlain, Narcissus. Commodus's death was as bizarre as his reign. He was strangled in his bath by his own wrestling coach, a symbol of the deep irony of his life and death. He had died not in battle or at the hands of a foreign invader, but at the hands of those who had once been closest to him. The immediate aftermath of Commodus's death was marked by a power vacuum that threw the Roman Empire into chaos. Commodus's reign had set the stage for an era of instability, as several men would claim the title of emperor, leading to the year of the 5 emperors in Rome's political turmoil would continue, and the empire would eventually face even greater challenges. Commodus's actions had weakened the empire from within, and his legacy was a broken Rome, one struggling to regain its strength. Legacy of Commodus. Commodus's legacy is one of decay and delusion. While some rulers are remembered for their cruelty, Commodus's cruelty was born from a place of narcissism and self-obsession. His reign, marked by decadence, cruelty, and neglect, was one of the catalysts for the Roman Empire's eventual decline. Though his reign began with potential, it ended in disaster. Commodus showed the world that the most dangerous type of ruler is not always the one who seeks power out of malice, but the one who believes they are above reproach, a ruler consumed by their own self-glorification and disconnected from reality. His reign serves as a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked ego and the devastating impact of a ruler more interested in personal indulgence than the health of their empire. Tamerlane, Timur 3036, 104-5. The bloodthirsty conqueror. Tamerlane, also known as Timur, was a Turco-Mongol conqueror who established the Timurid Empire in the late 14th century. Although he was celebrated for his military genius and ability to build a large empire, his methods of achieving power were anything but honorable. Tamerlane's reign is infamous for its extreme brutality and the bloodshed that accompanied his conquests. Unlike many other rulers who sought power through strategic alliances or diplomacy, Tamerlane's path to empire was carved with the bodies of the innocent, as he led an army that mercilessly slaughtered millions. A relentless pursuit of power, born in 1336 in what is now Uzbekistan, Tamerlane was originally a tribal leader with humble beginnings. His early life was not marked by privilege, but as he gained influence, he began to build an army that would eventually lay waste to much of Central Asia. His rise to power was rapid, and Tamerlane sought to carve out a legacy for himself, not by building relationships or fostering peace, but through violence. His hunger for conquest and dominance led him to declare war on virtually anyone who stood in his way. Tamerlane's ambition had no boundaries, and his military expeditions became notorious for their sheer ruthlessness. He would often stop at nothing to expand his empire, even if it meant wiping entire cities off the map. His tactics were precise, but terrifying in their effectiveness. Rather than being a diplomatic strategist, Tamerlane used force and terror to manipulate people into submission. His name alone struck fear into the hearts of his enemies, and it became synonymous with death and destruction. Over the next few decades, Tamerlane embarked on a campaign of relentless military expansion, conquering large parts of the Middle East, Central Asia, and even parts of India. But his legacy is not just about the vast lands he acquired, it's about the brutal methods he used to achieve this expansion. Tamerlane's siege tactics were incredibly effective, but they were also extremely cruel. He would destroy entire cities, leaving nothing but desolation in his wake. In the cities he captured, civilians were often executed en masse, and prisoners of war were subjected to unspeakable torture, massacres, and destruction. One of the most notorious aspects of Tamerlane's campaigns was his practice of mass slaughter. For instance, after he captured the city of Isfahan in Persia, it is estimated that he ordered the execution of as many as 7. The residents of Isfahan were killed in a horrific manner, with many of them being decapitated or forced to march into a mass grave to be buried alive. This was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a pattern throughout his military career. His army would leave behind mounds of skulls and bodies, a gruesome trademark of his campaigns. After his conquest of Delhi, Tamerlane's brutality reached new heights. In 1398, after his forces swept through the city, it is believed that he massacred over 100,000 people, including women and children. His soldiers would cut down anyone in their path, and the streets of Delhi were flooded with blood. The survivors were either enslaved or left to die of hunger and disease. The city was looted, and its monuments were desecrated. Tamerlane's forces didn't just sack the city, they left a deep, psychological scar on its people. Even today, the memory of that massacre is still felt, as it remains one of the most brutal episodes in Indian history. Tamerlane's violent campaigns didn't stop in the Middle East and India. He set his sights on Europe as well. His forces captured large parts of Russia and Europe, causing even more widespread death and destruction. In the city of Smyrna, modern-day Izmir, Turkey, he committed another horrific massacre where thousands of people were killed, and the city was left in ruins. A legacy of terror and fear. Tamerlane's conquests were so bloody that many of the regions he conquered would take centuries to recover. Entire cultures and populations were wiped out, and the devastation he left behind was felt across the Middle East, Central Asia, and parts of India. Historians have estimated that millions of people died at the hands of Tamerlane's armies. His violence was not only physical, but also psychological, as he instilled a deep terror that lasted long after his reign ended. What is perhaps most striking about Tamerlane's reign is the sheer magnitude of the destruction he caused. He was not only interested in conquering lands, but in completely obliterating the very fabric of society in those regions. Monuments, cities, and even entire civilizations were erased from the map. Tamerlane was so relentless that he would go to extreme lengths to ensure that his enemy's memory would be erased, and even their physical presence would be wiped out. The devastation he caused was not limited to the battlefield. It extended into the hearts of the people, who were left to rebuild from nothing. The Iron Fist and the Empire's legacy. Despite his unparalleled military successes, Tamerlane's empire ultimately failed to endure. After his death in 1405, the Timurid Empire crumbled, as it lacked the political cohesion and stability needed to survive long-term. The empire was too deeply rooted in fear and oppression, and after Tamerlane's passing, his heirs were unable to maintain the empire's strength. His empire, built on violence and terror, was doomed to collapse without strong foundations to hold it together. The legacy of Tamerlane, however, is one of controversy and lasting infamy. Some might argue that he brought order to a chaotic world, while others view him as a tyrant who unleashed unimaginable suffering on the world. Regardless of how he is viewed, there is no denying the sheer brutality of his reign and the unbelievable scale of destruction he caused. His conquests are a testament to the dangers of unchecked ambition and the costs of building an empire through violence. While Tamerlane is remembered in some circles as a great conqueror, his reign serves as a chilling warning about the consequences of leadership driven by fear, destruction, and bloodshed. Tamerlane's final years were marked by his attempts to conquer more territories, but age and illness eventually caught up with him. In 1405, while preparing for a military campaign in China, Tamerlane fell ill and died at the age of 6. His death, however, did not signal the end of his empire's brutality. His heirs, although less skilled and driven by his thirst for conquest, continued the tradition of ruthless expansion. Upon his death, his body was returned to Samarkand, where it was placed in a lavish tomb. Tamerlane's tomb still stands today as a reminder of his uncompromising ambition and his horrifying reign. It is said that after his death, his successors, even in their attempts to honor his memory, were never able to restore the ferocity of his empire. The world left behind by Tamerlane was scarred by his conquests, an empire that was as much about terror as it was about empire building. Legacy and reflection. Tamerlane's reign left a complex legacy, one marked by great achievement in terms of military prowess, but equally defined by the brutality and death that his expansion caused. It serves as a reminder that the pursuit of power at all costs can lead to unimaginable destruction. His conquests are a testament to the dangers of unchecked ambition and the costs of building an empire through violence. While Tamerlane is remembered in some circles as a great conqueror, his reign serves as a chilling warning about the consequences of leadership driven by fear, destruction, and bloodshed. Genghis Khan, 1162–1227. The unify with a bloody legacy. Genghis Khan, born Temujin in 1162, is remembered as one of the most successful and feared conquerors in history. He unified the Mongol tribes and founded the Mongol Empire, which became the largest contiguous empire in history. However, his rise to power and the methods he used to establish his empire were marked by extreme violence and ruthless tactics. While his military genius and ability to unite disparate tribes is often praised, the human cost of his conquests is staggering and cannot be ignored. A brutal path to power. Genghis Khan's early life was far from glamorous. Born into a tribal society that was divided and in conflict, he witnessed the brutality of life from a young age. His father was poisoned when he was just a child, leaving his family vulnerable. This early loss of stability fueled Temujin's desire for power and revenge, and he quickly learned the harsh realities of tribal life. He grew up among constant threats, often fighting for survival and dealing with betrayal and treachery. By the time he was in his 20s, Temujin had united several Mongol tribes under his leadership, becoming a powerful force. However, his rise to prominence came at the expense of countless lives. Rather than relying on diplomacy or alliances, he focused on crushing enemies through brutal warfare. His military tactics were innovative, using a combination of surprise attacks, psychological warfare, and fear to achieve his goals. He also made use of terror, a tool that would become a hallmark of his reign. Genghis Khan's ability to unite the Mongol tribes was not simply through inspiring loyalty or offering peace, but through coercion. Those who resisted his rule faced ruthless retribution. His policy of total war often meant the complete annihilation of those who dared to oppose him, with entire populations being slaughtered in the wake of his victories. Conquests and mass slaughter. The scope of Genghis Khan's conquests is staggering. He expanded his empire over an area larger than any before him, from the Pacific Ocean in the east to the Caspian Sea in the west. His campaigns took him across vast stretches of Asia and Europe, and he conquered cities that had stood for centuries. In many cases, the cities that resisted him faced massive destruction and genocide. One of the most notorious examples of his brutality occurred during the conquest of the city of Nishapur in modern-day Iran. After his forces overwhelmed the city, he ordered the mass execution of its citizens. It is said that 1.7 million people were killed, their deaths coming in waves of horrific violence. This wasn't an isolated incident. Genghis Khan's army was known for killing civilians by the thousands, and entire cities were razed to the ground. His army would not only kill soldiers but also civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. Entire populations were razed. After the Mongols laid siege to Bukhara, a key city in present-day Uzbekistan, the conquerors were merciless. The city was captured, and Genghis Khan's forces killed hundreds of thousands of people. Even those who had surrendered. The siege was marked by gruesome torture and executions, and the city was burned to the ground. One of the most infamous aspects of Genghis Khan's approach to war was his use of psychological warfare. His reputation for cruelty often preceded him, and many cities surrendered without a fight, simply to avoid the horrific fate that awaited those who resisted. His reputation for cruelty was so severe that many in the conquered regions feared the mere mention of his name, associating it with death and destruction. This fear, along with his military strategies, allowed him to expand his empire rapidly. Legacy of death and devastation. Despite his military genius, Genghis Khan's conquests were not without consequences for the regions he conquered. Historians estimate that his campaigns led to the deaths of tens of millions of people. The sheer scale of death and destruction that followed him was a direct result of his policies of total war and terror. In some regions, entire cultures and civilizations were decimated, and the impact of his conquests was felt for generations. His tactics of warfare and mass slaughter were unlike anything the world had seen before. While some may argue that his conquests helped to unify large parts of Asia and spread new ideas, such as trade and culture, the price of this unification was immeasurable suffering. The people of the regions he conquered often found themselves trapped between the Mongol forces on one side and the harsh realities of subjugation on the other. In China, for example, Genghis Khan's campaigns led to the fall of the Jin dynasty and the destruction of numerous cities. The Mongols imposed harsh rule over the Chinese population, with severe punishments for those who resisted. The devastating impact on the Chinese people's lives is still remembered today, and the scars of that era remain. The cultural impact and legacy of fear. While Genghis Khan's conquests certainly had far-reaching effects on trade and communication, thanks to the Pax Mongolica, the destruction he caused also left deep cultural scars. His reign changed the course of history, but the way he achieved his success, through sheer violence and terror, is the true measure of his legacy. In many parts of the world, his name still evokes a sense of fear and terror, with his empire often associated with devastation. Perhaps one of the most enduring elements of Genghis Khan's legacy is his ability to use fear as a tool of control. The very mention of his name would send ripples of terror through the populations of those who lived under his rule. His army was feared for its speed, brutality, and ability to strike with overwhelming force. His reign is remembered as a time of great violence, destruction, and death, one that affected entire civilizations, leaving a lasting impression on the world. Genghis Khan's final years and legacy. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, he had already achieved unparalleled military success. His empire stretched across vast territories, and he had established a lasting legacy in the form of the Mongol Empire. However, his death didn't signal the end of the Mongol conquests, as his descendants would continue his work. The empire he built would later fracture and split, but the impact of his brutal rule was indelible. The empire he left behind was one that was still rooted in violence and terror, as his successors carried on his ruthless methods of governance. The Mongol Empire, despite its impressive size and success, was one that was built on the bodies of millions and shaped by the bloodshed of conquest. Genghis Khan's legacy remains a complex one. He is remembered as one of the greatest military tacticians in history, yet his rule remains a tragic example of the horrors of unchecked ambition and brutal conquest. His rise to power and the ways he maintained it were based on force, destruction, and an utter disregard for human life. Idi Amin, 1971–1979, the butcher of Uganda, born in Koboko, Uganda. In 1925, Amin's early life was unremarkable, and he was raised in a poor family. He joined the British colonial army at a young age, where he began to climb the ranks of Uganda's military. Though he was a largely uneducated man, he quickly made a name for himself through his brutal tactics and ruthless ambition. By the time Uganda gained independence in 1962, Amin was a prominent figure in the Ugandan army, having risen to the rank of Sergeant Major. Amin's rise to power began in 1971, when he staged a military coup against Uganda's then president, Milton Obote. The coup was swift and violent, with Obote fleeing the country. Amin, initially seen as a puppet leader of the military, quickly consolidated his power and declared himself president for life. What followed was a period of unimaginable brutality, with Amin's rule causing devastation to Uganda's social, economic, and political fabric. A reign of terror. Amin's regime was marked by widespread violence and repression. One of his first acts as leader was to purge his political enemies within the military and government. The most notable of these purges was the killing of prominent political figures, many of whom were executed without trial. The brutality of Amin's forces was notorious, and they conducted mass arrest, detentions, and executions on a scale rarely seen in modern history. Many of Amin's victims were ethnic minorities, particularly the Akoli and Lango peoples, who were blamed for supporting Amin's predecessor, Milton Obote. The purge led to the mass execution of thousands of these ethnic groups, with entire families wiped out in some cases. Torture and forced disappearances became common tools of governance, and anyone suspected of opposing Amin's rule faced a horrific fate. Amin also waged a brutal campaign against intellectuals and the educated classes, seeing them as a threat to his power. University professors, journalists, and politicians were rounded up, and many were subjected to horrific torture or executed. Amin's regime also led to the exodus of Uganda's educated class, further decimating the country's intellectual and cultural resources. The expulsion of Asians and economic collapse. One of the most infamous actions of Amin's reign was the expulsion of Uganda's Asian population in 1972. Amin blamed Indian and Pakistani traders for the economic difficulties facing Uganda, accusing them of exploiting the Ugandan people. He gave these non-citizen Asians just 90 days to leave the country. Thousands of families were forced to abandon their businesses, homes, and livelihoods, and many fled to neighboring countries or back to India and Pakistan. The expulsion of the Asian population had a catastrophic impact on Uganda's economy. The majority of Uganda's skilled labor force was comprised of Asians, particularly in the trade and manufacturing sectors. With their sudden expulsion, the country experienced an economic collapse, as local Ugandans lacked the expertise and experience to fill the void. Inflation skyrocketed, and poverty deepened, leaving the majority of the population in dire strait. The forced departure of so many skilled and educated people severely set back Uganda's economic development, which would take decades to recover. The lack of a skilled workforce led to dilapidated infrastructure, broken supply chains, and a general decline in living standards for Ugandans. The cult of personality. Amin's personality cult was one of the most peculiar aspects of his rule. He sought to elevate himself as a larger-than-life figure, constantly reinforcing his image as a mighty ruler. He coined an extensive list of titles, which included His Excellency, President for Life, Field Marshal Alhaji Idi Amin Dada, and even Conqueror of the British Empire. These grandiose titles were meant to inflate Amin's self-image, and he surrounded himself with praise and adoration from state-run media, constantly reminding Ugandans of his greatness. Amin also presented himself as a leader who had liberated Uganda from colonial powers and was on a mission to create a strong and independent African nation. He proclaimed himself the defender of the African continent, and regularly made anti-colonial speeches to build support among Africans. However, these grandiose speeches masked the reality of his corrupt, oppressive, and dangerous leadership. Despite his claims of a strong and independent Uganda, his actions often portrayed a leader focused more on personal glorification than the country's well-being. His regime increasingly alienated international allies, and he was eventually regarded as a pariah by much of the world, a descent into madness. Over time, Amin's mental state appeared to deteriorate. He became increasingly paranoid, convinced that his own military and political allies were plotting against him. This paranoia led him to purge his closest supporters and execute many of his generals and ministers. His erratic behavior and irrational decisions became a hallmark of his leadership. Amin's erratic actions also included bizarre public declarations, such as his claim to be the King of Scotland, as well as his support for extreme anti-Semitic rhetoric and his open embrace of international terrorist groups. These actions only deepened Uganda's isolation on the world stage as his regime became increasingly unstable. The war with Tanzania and the fall of Amin. By 1978, Amin's leadership was on the brink of collapse. His ill-advised invasion of Tanzania in 1978 sparked a full-scale war, which proved disastrous for his regime. The invasion was prompted by Amin's desire to annex the Kagera region, which was located on the border between Uganda and Tanzania. However, the conflict quickly escalated, and Tanzanian forces retaliated with a counter-offensive. By April 1979, Tanzanian forces had reached the Ugandan capital of Kampala, forcing Amin to flee the country. His fall from power was swift, and Amin was exiled to Saudi Arabia, where he would live for the rest of his life in relative obscurity. Despite his exile, the damage he had caused to Uganda's people, infrastructure, and society was irreparable. A legacy of suffering. Idi Amin's legacy is one of suffering, loss, and irreversible harm to Uganda. His reign left Uganda's economy shattered, its people terrorized, and its political system in tatters. His brutal tactics and policies are a stark reminder of the destructive power of unchecked dictatorship. The millions of Ugandans who lived under his reign and the countless victims who lost their lives will forever be haunted by the impact of his cruelty. Today, the memory of Amin's rule remains a chilling reminder of the dangers of absolute power and the capacity of leaders to cause unspeakable harm when they are allowed to reign without limits. His name will forever be synonymous with tyranny, and his reign stands as one of the darkest chapters in the history of modern Africa. Joseph Stalin, 1924-1953. The Man of Steel. Joseph Stalin, who led the Soviet Union from 1924 until his death in 1953, is often regarded as one of the most brutal dictators in modern history. His reign, which lasted nearly 3 decades, is marked by extreme repression, widespread purges, massive famines, and a culture of fear that permeated every aspect of Soviet life. Stalin's rule, while transforming the Soviet Union into a global superpower, also caused the death of millions and the destruction of countless lives. His name is synonymous with terror, totalitarianism, and unchecked power. The legacy of his reign is one of overwhelming human suffering, and his actions left an indelible mark on the history of the 20th century. The rise to power. Stalin's journey to the leadership of the Soviet Union was long and deliberate. Born in 1878 in Georgia, he grew up in a poor and abusive household. Despite these challenges, Stalin's ambition and hunger for power led him to join the Bolshevik Party. He initially took part in revolutionary activities and was a key figure during the Russian Revolution of 19. In the wake of the revolution, he worked his way up the ranks of the Communist Party, gradually gaining more power and influence. After the death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924, Stalin skillfully eliminated his rivals, notably Leon Trotsky, through political maneuvering and personal alliances. By the late 1920s, Stalin had consolidated power establishing himself as the unchallenged leader of the Soviet Union. His ascent to power was not immediate. It was a process of manipulation, betrayal, and shrewd calculation. Once in control, Stalin's leadership style quickly became known for its absolute authority and ruthless suppression of dissent. The Great Purge and Terror. Once Stalin had established complete control over the Soviet Union, he began his reign of terror. One of the most infamous aspects of Stalin's rule was the Great Purge, a brutal campaign of political repression, mass executions, and forced labor that lasted from The purge targeted anyone perceived as a potential threat to Stalin's absolute authority, including Communist Party members, military leaders, intellectuals, and even ordinary citizens. Anyone could be accused of treason, counter-revolutionary activity, or simply being a threat to Stalin's power, and they would be arrested, tortured, and either executed or sent to labor camps. The Great Terror caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. Stalin's paranoia led him to purge entire sections of society, including key members of the Red Army, which significantly weakened the Soviet military just before the outbreak of World War II. Many Soviet citizens were dragged from their homes in the dead of night, never to be seen again. Families were torn apart, and an atmosphere of fear and distrust gripped the entire nation. Even the military leadership, once loyal to Stalin, was purged, and by the time of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Stalin had already wiped out many of the best military minds in the country. The famine and forced collectivization. Stalin's policies were not limited to political repression. His economic reforms also led to widespread suffering. Forced collectivization was one of his most devastating policies. In an attempt to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union, Stalin ordered the forced consolidation of individual farms into large, state-controlled collective farms. While the policy was intended to increase agricultural production, it instead led to widespread famine and economic devastation. Millions of peasants were displaced, and their crops were confiscated by the state to support industrial growth. The Holodomor famine of 1932-1933, which took place in Soviet-controlled Ukraine, remains one of the most tragic examples of Stalin's policies. The famine was caused by Stalin's demand for grain requisitioning, which forced Ukrainian farmers to surrender their crops to the state. Despite the horrific toll of starvation, Stalin's government took no action to alleviate the suffering of the Ukrainian people. Instead, Stalin continued to export grain from Ukraine, exacerbating the famine. It is estimated that millions of Ukrainians died from starvation, and the death toll from the famine remains a contentious issue, with figures ranging from 3 million to 7 million deaths. The forced collectivization campaign didn't stop there. Resistance to collectivization was met with brutal repression, including execution, deportation, and imprisonment in labor camps. Entire communities were wiped out in Stalin's drive to impose control over agriculture, and the rural economy was decimated. Many peasants were branded as kulaks, or wealthy peasants, and were labeled enemies of the state, leading to their mass deportation to Siberian labor camps. World War II and Stalin's paranoia. Stalin's leadership during World War II was marked by both moments of brilliance and critical mistakes. In the early years of the war, Stalin failed to anticipate Nazi Germany's invasion in 1941, despite receiving intelligence warnings. His earlier purges had weakened the Soviet military's high command, which left the country ill-prepared for the German onslaught. When Hitler's Operation Barbarossa launched, the Soviet Union was caught off guard, and millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians died in the early stages of the war. Despite the initial setbacks, Stalin managed to rally the Soviet people and the Red Army to eventually push the Nazis out of Soviet territory. The Battle of Stalingrad, 1942-1943, was a turning point in the war, and Soviet victory in the battle helped shift the momentum in favor of the Allies. However, Stalin's leadership during the war was not without its flaws. He maintained a tight grip on the military and interfered in military strategy, sometimes making decisions that cost valuable lives. His distrust of military leaders and his inability to effectively delegate authority led to unnecessary losses, and his paranoia made him a difficult leader to work with. Despite these flaws, Stalin's victory over Nazi Germany was seen as a major achievement, and the Soviet Union emerged from the war as one of the world's two superpowers, along with the United States. However, this victory came at an enormous human cost: post-war repression and Stalin's legacy. After the war, Stalin continued his harsh rule, repressing any form of dissent and consolidating power. His regime did not ease up after the war ended. Instead, it maintained its firm grip on the Soviet Union. Stalin's paranoia remained a dominant feature of his leadership style, and he continued to suppress real and imagined threats to his rule. Millions of Soviet citizens remained in labor camps, and Stalin's secret police kept a watchful eye over the population. Stalin's legacy is one of mass suffering, political purges, forced labor, and systematic repression. While he transformed the Soviet Union into a global power, the human cost of his actions was staggering. Under his rule, millions of people died from starvation, execution, and forced labor. His totalitarian rule crushed any semblance of freedom and created a society where fear and loyalty were paramount. Stalin's impact on the Soviet Union and the world cannot be overstated. He created a cult of personality around himself and transformed Soviet society into a machine of state control. His policies devastated the Soviet economy and wiped out entire generations. Though his actions led to Soviet victories in World War II and the establishment of the Soviet Union as a superpower, it is the human cost of his leadership that defines Stalin's reign. Joseph Stalin's rule serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and totalitarianism. His actions have left an indelible mark on world history, and his legacy continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the destructive potential of absolute authority. Pol Pot, 1975–1979. The architect of the killing fields, Pol Pot, the leader of Cambodia from 1975 to 1979, is widely considered one of the most ruthless and destructive rulers in modern history. His time in power was marked by brutality, oppression, and genocide, which caused the deaths of nearly 2 million people, roughly 1/4 of Cambodia's population. The policies of his regime, the Khmer Rouge, devastated the country and left a dark legacy that still affects Cambodia today. Pol Pot's vision of a communist agrarian society became a nightmare that led to mass executions, forced labor, starvation, and psychological trauma that lasted long after his downfall. His reign, although short, is among the most brutal in recorded history, with his government known for its radical social engineering that sought to transform Cambodia into a completely agrarian utopia, erasing all traces of urbanization and modernity. The rise to power. Pol Pot was born in 1925 in Prek Spao, Cambodia, into a relatively wealthy family, but it was his exposure to Marxist ideology during his time in France that set the stage for his later political career. While in France, Pol Pot studied at the University of Paris and became influenced by the political and revolutionary ideas that were sweeping through Europe. He became a committed Marxist-Leninist, which led him to embrace revolutionary communism as the only means to address the inequalities and injustices in his home country. Upon his return to Cambodia, he joined the Indo-Chinese Communist Party and began working with other like-minded communists to form a resistance against the monarchy and French colonial influence. In the early 1960s, Pol Pot became a prominent member of the Khmer Rouge, the communist movement that sought to overthrow the existing Cambodian government. By 1968, the Khmer Rouge had gained significant traction in rural Cambodia, where discontent with the ruling government and its ties to the United States was growing. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Khmer Rouge began waging an insurgency against the Cambodian government, leading to an eventual collapse of the country's political structure. Pol Pot became the leader of the Khmer Rouge, and his ideas began to take shape as he envisioned a country that would be entirely free from what he saw as the corrupting influences of capitalism, foreign influence, and modernity. The fall of Phnom Penh and the start of the Khmer Rouge regime. In April 1975, the Khmer Rouge, under Pol Pot's leadership, took Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, without much resistance. The fall of Phnom Penh marked the beginning of a new era for Cambodia, one that would be defined by extreme cruelty and the brutal implementation of Pol Pot's vision. The Khmer Rouge forced the entire population of Phnom Penh, as well as other cities, into the countryside. The residents were told that the capital would be bombed by US forces, and they had to leave immediately to avoid being killed. This was the first step in Pol Pot's vision to transform Cambodia into a rural, agricultural society, free of urbanization and any sign of modernity. The Khmer Rouge imposed collectivization on the population, forcing people to give up their private property, and they abolished money, religion, and any semblance of social or economic organization that existed under the previous government. They divided the population into two classes: the peasants, who were viewed as pure and who would help to build the new society, and the urbanites, who were deemed enemies of the state and were treated as suspect. Those who were seen as elite, including teachers, doctors, engineers, intellectuals, and anyone who was educated, were considered enemies of the regime and were targeted for extermination. People who wore glasses, spoke foreign languages, or had any connection to Western culture were often executed on the spot. The killing fields and the path of destruction. Under Pol Pot's leadership, Cambodia quickly descended into one of the most horrific genocides in history. The Khmer Rouge set up re-education camps where people were forced into hard labor under inhumane conditions, and many were tortured or executed for minor offenses. Those who survived were often left malnourished and severely traumatized. The infamous killing fields, where mass executions took place, became the symbol of Pol Pot's brutality. The Khmer Rouge's official policy was to eliminate anyone who could challenge their new world order, and their methods of execution were extreme. Victims were often beaten to death, bayoneted, or decapitated, and their bodies were dumped into mass graves. The Khmer Rouge regime also forced the population to work in brutal conditions on agricultural collectives. People were starved, forced to work endless hours, and subjected to grueling physical labor in the hot Cambodian sun. Those who were too weak to continue working were left to die in the fields, and many of the children who were forced to work had little chance of survival. Diseases such as malaria and dysentery swept through the country, and with no medical care or proper sanitation, the death toll continued to rise. Pol Pot's regime had no regard for human life, and the system of labor camps and executions only escalated the atrocities. The fall of Pol Pot's regime. After almost 4 years of violence and suffering, Vietnam invaded Cambodia in 1979, toppling the Khmer Rouge and ending Pol Pot's reign of terror. The Vietnamese forces liberated Cambodia and drove the Khmer Rouge into the jungle, but the damage had already been done. The country was left in ruins, with a devastated population and a generation of Cambodians forever scarred by the brutality they had endured. Pol Pot fled into the jungle, where he continued to lead the Khmer Rouge forces in a guerrilla war against the Cambodian government. For years, he evaded capture and was able to maintain a foothold in the Thai border region. But by the early 1990s, his influence had waned. Pol Pot was arrested in 1997 by members of his own party after a failed coup, and he was held under house arrest until his death in. He never faced trial for the crimes he committed, and he died without ever being held fully accountable for his role in the genocide that took place under his regime. The legacy of Pol Pot. Pol Pot's rule left Cambodia broken and traumatized. The country's population was decimated, and its social structure was obliterated. Cambodia's infrastructure was destroyed, and education and healthcare was set back for decades. The genocide left deep scars on the Cambodian people, and the effects of his whistles can still be felt today. Families were torn apart, and entire communities were wiped out. The survivors of the Khmer Rouge era continue to live with the psychological scars of the violence and trauma they endured. Today, Cambodia is still in the process of healing from the horrors of Pol Pot's regime. While the country has made significant strides in rebuilding its economy and government institutions, the trauma of the genocide continues to haunt the nation. Many Cambodians still bear the emotional scars of the killing fields, and efforts to bring those responsible for the genocide to justice have been slow and complicated. Pol Pot's legacy remains a painful reminder of the consequences of unchecked power, ideological extremism, and the dangers of authoritarian rule. Pol Pot's regime is widely regarded as one of the most brutal and destructive in the history of the 20th century. His policies not only destroyed a nation, but also inflicted unimaginable suffering on millions of innocent people. Pol Pot's name is now synonymous with genocide and dictatorship, and his reign is a tragic chapter in the history of Cambodia that serves as a chilling warning of the dangers of totalitarianism and extremist ideology.